The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 7, Side 2. The reign of evil will be brought to an end, according to the apocalyptic books, either by the direct intervention of God himself, or the earthly coming of his Son or representative, the Messiah or Anointed One. Had not the prophet Isaiah, a century back, foretold him? For unto us a child is born, a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called the Mighty God, the Prince of Peace. Many Jews agreed with Isaiah's chapter 11, verse 1, in describing the Messiah as an earthly king who would be born of the royal house of David. Others, like the authors of Enoch and Daniel, called him the Son of Man and pictured him as coming down from heaven. The philosopher of Proverbs and the poet of the Wisdom of Solomon, perhaps influenced by Plato's ideas or the Stoic Anima Mundi, saw him as incarnate wisdom, the first begotten of God, the Word, or reason, logos, that would soon play so great a role in Philo's philosophy. Nearly all the apocalyptic authors thought that the Messiah would triumph speedily, but Isaiah, in a remarkable passage, had conceived him as despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities, and with his stripes we are healed. The Lord hath laid upon him the iniquity of us all. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and was cut off out of the land of the living. He bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. All, however, agreed that in the end the Messiah would subdue the heathen, free Israel, make Jerusalem his capital, and win all men to accept Yahweh and the Mosaic law. Thereafter a good time would come of happiness for the whole world. All the earth would be fertile, every seed would bear 1,000-fold, wine would be plentiful, poverty would disappear, all men would be healthy and virtuous, and justice, good fellowship, and peace would reign over the earth. Some seers thought that this joyful age would be interrupted, that the powers of darkness and evil would make a last assault upon the happy kingdom, and that the world would be consumed in chaos and conflagration. In the final day of God, the dead would rise and be judged by the Ancient of Days, Yahweh, or by the Son of Man, to whom absolute and everlasting dominion would then be given over a renovated world, the kingdom of God. The wicked would be cast down headlong and speechless into hell, but the good would be received into unending blessedness. Essentially, the movement of thought in Judea was parallel with that in the pagan theology of the time. A people that had once thought of the future in terms of its national destiny lost its trust in the state and thought of salvation in spiritual and individual terms. The mystery religions had brought this hope to many millions in Greece, the Hellenic East, and Italy, but nowhere was the hope so earnest or its need so great as in Judea. The poor or bereaved, the oppressed or scorned of the earth looked for some divine redeemer of their subjection and their suffering. Soon, said the apocalypses, a Savior would come, and in his triumph all just men would be lifted up, even out of the grave, into a paradise of eternal bliss. Old saints like Simeon, mystic women like Anna, daughter of Phanuel, passed their lives about the temple, fasting, waiting, praying that they might look upon the Redeemer before they died. A great expectation filled the hearts of men. 6. The Rebellion. No people in history has fought so tenaciously for liberty as the Jews, nor any people against such odds. From Judas Maccabee to Simeon Bar Kokhba, and even into our own time, the struggle of the Jews to regain their freedom has often decimated them, but has never broken their spirit or their hope. When Herod the Great died, the nationalists, spurning the pacific counsels of Hillel, declared a revolt against Herod's successor Archelaus, and encamped in tents about the temple. Archelaus's troops slew 3,000 of them, many of whom had come to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, this in 4 B.C. At the following Feast of Pentecost, the rebels gathered again, and once more suffered great slaughter. The temple cloisters were burned to the ground, the treasures of the sanctuary were plundered by the legions, and many Jews killed themselves in despair. Patriot bands took form in the countryside, and made life precarious for any supporter of Rome. One such band, under Judas the Gaulonite, captured Sepphoris, the capital of Galilee. Varus, governor of Syria, entered Palestine with 20,000 men, razed hundreds of towns, crucified 2,000 rebels, and sold 30,000 Jews into slavery. A delegation of leading Jews went to Rome and begged Augustus to abolish the kingship in Judea. Augustus removed Archelaus and made Judea a Roman province of the second class, under a procurator responsible to the governor of Syria, this in AD 6. Under Tiberius, the troubled land knew a moment's peace. Caligula, wishing to make the worship of the emperor a unifying religion throughout the empire, ordered all cults to include a sacrifice to his image and bade the Jerusalem officials to install his statue in the temple. The Jews had compromised under Augustus and Tiberius by sacrificing to Yahweh in the name of the emperor, but they were so averse to setting up the graven image of a pagan in their temple that thousands of them, we are told, went to the governor of Syria and asked to be slain in cold blood before the edict should be carried out. Caligula eased the situation by dying. Impressed by Herod's grandson Agrippa, Claudius made him king of nearly all Palestine, this in 41. But Agrippa's sudden death released another outburst of disorder, and Claudius restored the procutorial rule, this in 44. The men whom his mercenary freedmen chose for this office were mostly incompetents or scoundrels. Felix, made procurator by his brother Pallas, governed Judea, says Tacitus, with the powers of a king and the soul of a slave. Festus ruled more justly, but died in the attempt. Albinus, if we may believe Josephus, plundered and taxed assiduously and made a fortune by releasing criminals from jail for a consideration. Nobody remained in prison but those who gave him nothing. Florus, says the same friend and admirer of the Romans, behaved like an executioner rather than a governor, despoiled whole cities, and not only stole on his own account but connived at other robberies if allowed to share the loot. These reports retained some odor of war propaganda. Doubtless the procurators complained that the Jews were a very troublesome people to oppress. Bands of zealots and daggermen, or sicarii, were formed in protest against this misrule. Their members, pledged to kill any disloyal Jew, mingled in street gatherings, stabbed their appointed victims from behind, and disappeared in the chaos of the crowd. When Florus took 17 talents, or $61,200, from the temple treasury, an angry mob collected before the shrine and cried out for his dismissal. Some youths went about with baskets begging alms for him as suffering from poverty. Florus's legions dispersed the assemblage, plundered hundreds of homes, and slew the occupants. The leading rebels were scourged and crucified. On that day, says Josephus, 3,600 Jews were slain. The old or well-to-do Hebrews counseled patience, arguing that revolt against so powerful an empire would be national suicide. The young or poor accused them of connivance and cowardice. The two factions divided the city and nearly every family. One seized the upper part of Jerusalem and the other the lower, and each attacked the other with every weapon at hand. In 68, a pitched battle was fought between the groups. The radicals won and killed 12,000 Jews, including nearly all the rich. The revolt had become a revolution. A rebel force surrounded the Roman garrison at Masada, persuaded it to disarm, and then slaughtered every man of it. On that day, the Gentiles of Caesarea, the Palestinian capital, rose in a pogrom that slew 20,000 Jews. Other thousands were sold into slavery. In one day, the Gentiles of Damascus cut the throats of 10,000 Jews. The enraged revolutionists laid waste many Greek cities in Palestine and Syria, burned some of them to the ground, and were killed in great number. It was then common, says Josephus, to see cities filled with dead bodies, unburied, those of old men mixed with infants, and women lying among them without any cover. By September of 66, the revolution had won Jerusalem and nearly all of Palestine. The peace party was discredited, and most of its members now joined in the revolt. Among them was a priest named Josephus, then a young man of 30, energetic, brilliant, and endowed with an intellect capable of transforming every desire into a virtue. Commissioned by the rebels to fortify Galilee, he defended its stronghold, Jotapata, against Vespasian's siege until only 40 Jewish soldiers remained alive, hiding with him in a cave. Josephus wished to surrender, but his men threatened to kill him if he tried it. Since they preferred death to capture, he persuaded them to draw lots to fix the order in which each should die by the hand of the next. When all were dead but himself and one other, he induced him to join in surrender. They were about to be sent to Rome in chains when Josephus prophesied that Vespasian would be emperor. Vespasian released him and gradually accepted him as a useful adviser in the war against the Jews. When Vespasian left for Alexandria, Josephus accompanied Titus to the siege of Jerusalem. The approach of the legions brought the defenders to a belated and fanatical unity. Tacitus reckons that 600,000 rebels had gathered in the city. All who were capable of serving appeared in arms, and the women were not less martial than the men. Josephus, from the Roman lines, called upon the besieged to surrender. They branded him as a traitor and fought to the last. Starving Jews made desperate sorties to forage for food. Thousands of them were captured by the Romans and were crucified. The multitude of these was so great, Josephus reports, that room was wanting for the crosses and crosses were wanting for the bodies. In the later stages of the 5-month siege, the streets of the city were clogged with corpses. Ghouls wandered about despoiling and stabbing the dead. We are told that 116,000 bodies were thrown over the walls. Some Jews swallowed gold pieces and slipped out from Jerusalem. Romans or Syrians, capturing them, slid open their bellies or searched their offal to find the coins. Having taken half the city, Titus offered what he thought were lenient terms to the rebels. They rejected them. The flaming brands of the Romans set fire to the temple, and the great edifice, much of it of wood, was rapidly consumed. The surviving defenders fought bravely, proud, says Dio, to die on temple grounds. Some killed one another, some fell upon their own swords, some leaped into the flames. The victors gave no quarter, but slew all Jews upon whom they could lay their hands. 97,000 fugitives were caught and sold as slaves. Many of them died as unwilling gladiators in the triumphal games that were celebrated at Berytus, Caesarea Philippi, and Rome. Josephus numbered at 1,197,000 the Jews killed in this siege and its aftermath. Tacitus calculated them at 600,000, this in AD 70. Resistance continued here and there till 73, but essentially the destruction of the temple marked the end of the rebellion and of the Jewish state. The property of those who had shared in the revolt was confiscated and sold. Judea was almost shorn of Jews, and those that remained lived on the edge of starvation. Even the poorest Jew had now to pay to a pagan temple at Rome the half-shekel that pious Hebrews had formerly paid each year for the upkeep of the temple at Jerusalem. The high priesthood and the Sanhedrin were abolished. Judaism took the form that it has kept till our own time, a religion without a central shrine, without a dominant priesthood, without a sacrificial service. The Sadducees disappeared, while the Pharisees and the rabbis became the leaders of a homeless people that had nothing left but its synagogues and its hope. 7. The dispersion. The flight or enslavement of 1 million Jews so accelerated their spread through the Mediterranean that their scholars came to date the Diaspora from the destruction of Herod's temple. We have seen that this dispersion had begun 6 centuries before in the Babylonian captivity and had been renewed in the settling of Alexandria. Since fertility was commanded and infanticide sternly forbidden by Jewish piety and law, the expansion of the Jews was due to biological as well as economic causes. Hebrews still played a very minor role in the commerce of the world. 50 years before the fall of Jerusalem, Strabo, with anti-Semitic exaggeration, reported that it is hard to find a single place on the habitable earth that has not admitted this tribe of men and is not possessed by it. Philo, 20 years before the dispersion, described the continents full of Jewish settlements and likewise the islands and nearly all Babylonia. By AD 70, there were thousands of Jews in Seleucia on the Tigris and in other Parthian cities. They were numerous in Arabia and crossed thence into Ethiopia. They abounded in Syria and Phoenicia. They had large colonies in Tarsus, Antioch, Miletus, Ephesus, Sardis, Smyrna. They were only less numerous in Delos, Corinth, Athens, Philippi, Patri, Thessalonica. In the west there were Jewish communities in Carthage, Syracuse, Puteoli, Capua, Pompeii, Rome, even in Horace's native Venusia. All in all, we may reckon 7 million Jews in the empire, some 7% of the population, twice their proportion in the United States of America today. Their number, dress, diet, circumcision, poverty, ambition, prosperity, exclusiveness, intelligence, aversion to images, and observation of an inconvenient Sabbath, aroused an anti-Semitism that ranged from jokes in the theater and slurs in Juvenal and Tacitus to murders in the street and wholesale pogroms. Appian of Alexandria made himself the chief mouthpiece of these attacks, and Josephus answered him in an incisive pamphlet. After the fall of Jerusalem, Josephus sailed to Rome with Titus and accompanied the conqueror of his people in a triumphal procession that exhibited captive Jews and Jewish spoils. Vespasian gave him Roman citizenship, a pension, an apartment in his palace, and profitable lands in Judea. In return, Josephus took Vespasian's family name Flavius and wrote the Wars of the Jews, this in circa 75, to defend the actions of Titus in Palestine, to exonerate his own defection, and to discourage further revolt by showing forth the might of Rome. In his later years, circa 93, feeling more keenly his isolation, he wrote the Antiquities of the Jews to regain the goodwill of his people by giving Gentiles a more favorable view of Jewish achievements, customs, and characters. His narratives are clear and forceful, and his account of Herod the Great is as engaging as Plutarch, but his bias and his aims impair his objectivity. The Antiquities required many years and exhausted the author's strength. The last 4 of the 20 books were written by his secretaries from his notes. Josephus was still but 56 when the work appeared, but he was already worn out by a life of adventure, controversy, and moral solitude. With their characteristic resilience, the Jews gradually rebuilt their economic and cultural life in Palestine. Amid the siege of Jerusalem, an aged pupil of Hillel, Yohanan ben Zakkai, fearful lest the carnage should destroy all teachers and transmitters of the oral tradition, escaped from the city and set up an academy in a vineyard at Yabna, or Jamnia, near the Mediterranean coast. When Jerusalem fell, Yohanan organized a new Sanhedrin at Jamnia, composed not of priests, politicians, and rich men, but of Pharisees and rabbis, that is, teachers of the law. This Bet Din, or council, had no political power, but most Palestinian Jews recognized its authority in all matters of religion and morals. The patriarch whom the council chose as its head appointed the administrative officers of the Jewish community and had the power to excommunicate recalcitrant Jews. The stern discipline of the patriarch Gamaliel II, circa 100, welded into unity first the council, then the Jews of Jamnia, then the Jews of Palestine. Under his leadership, the contradictory interpretations of the law transmitted by Hillel and Shammai were reviewed and voted on. Those of Hillel were for the most part approved, and were made binding upon all Jews. Since the law was now the indispensable cement of scattered and stateless Jewry, the teaching of the law became the chief occupation of the synagogue throughout the Diaspora. The synagogue replaced the temple, prayer replaced sacrifice, the rabbi replaced the priest. Tanaim, or expositors, interpreted one or another of the orally transmitted laws, or halacha, of the Jews, usually supported it with scriptural quotation, sometimes added to it, and illustrated it with stories, homilies, or other material, or Haggadah. The most famous of the Tanaim was Rabbi Akiba ben Joseph. At the age of 40, in circa AD 80, he joined his 5-year-old son at school and learned to read. Soon he could recite the whole Pentateuch by heart. After 13 years of study, he opened his own school under a fig tree in a village near Jamnia. His enthusiasm and idealism, his courage and humor, even his lusty dogmatism, brought him many students. When in 95 word came that Domitian was planning new measures against the Jews, Akiba was chosen with Gamaliel and 2 others to make a personal appeal to the emperor. While they were in Rome, Domitian died. Nerva heard their plea favorably and ended the fiscus Judaicus, the tax laid upon Jews for rebuilding Rome. On his return to Jamnia, Akiba set himself the lifelong task of codifying the halakha. His pupil, Rabbi Meir, and their successor, Judah the Patriarch, circa 200, completed the undertaking. Even in this classified form, the halakha remained part of the oral tradition, handed down from generation to generation by scholars and professional memorizers, living textbooks of the law. Akiba's methods were as absurd as his conclusions were sound. He derived liberal principles from a weird exegesis in which every letter of the Torah or written law was held to have a mysterious meaning. Perhaps he had observed that men will accept the rational only in the form of the mystical. From Akiba came that painstaking organization and exposition of theology and ethics, which passed down through the Talmud to Maimonides, and ultimately to the methods of the scholastic philosophers. In his 90th year, when he had grown weak and reactionary, Akiba found himself, as in his youth, surrounded by revolution. In 115 to 116, the Jews of Cyrene, Egypt, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia rose once more against Rome. The massacre of Gentiles by Jews and of Jews by Gentiles became the order of the day. 220,000 men, says Dio, were killed in Cyrene, 240,000 in Cyprus. The figures are incredible, but we know that Cyrene never recovered from the devastation, and that for centuries thereafter no Hebrew was allowed in Cyprus. The uprisings were suppressed, but the surviving Jews kept fiercely alive their hope of a Messiah who would rebuild the temple and restore them in triumph to Jerusalem. Roman stupidity reanimated the revolt. In 130, Hadrian declared his intention to raise a shrine to Jupiter on the site of the temple. In 131, he issued a decree forbidding circumcision and public instruction in the Jewish law. Under the leadership of Simeon bar Kokhba, who claimed to be the Messiah, the Jews made their last effort in antiquity to recover their homeland and their freedom, this in 132. Akiba, who all his life had preached peace, gave his blessing to the revolution by accepting bar Kokhba as the promised redeemer. For 3 years the rebels fought valiantly against the legions. Finally they were beaten by lack of food and supplies. The Romans destroyed 985 towns in Palestine and slew 580,000 men. A still larger number, we are told, perished through starvation, disease, and fire. Nearly all Judea was laid waste. Bar Kokhba himself fell in defending Bethar. So many Jews were sold as slaves that their price fell to that of a horse. Thousands hid in underground channels rather than be captured. Surrounded by the Romans, they died one by one of hunger, while the living ate the bodies of the dead. Resolved to destroy the recuperative virility of Judaism, Hadrian forbade not merely circumcision, but the observance of the Sabbath or any Jewish holy day, and the public performance of any Hebrew ritual. A new and heavier poll tax was placed upon all Jews. They were allowed in Jerusalem only on one fixed day each year, when they might come and weep before the ruins of their temple. The pagan city of Aelia Capitolina rose on the site of Jerusalem, with shrines to Jupiter and Venus, and with palæstras, theaters, and baths. The council at Jamnia was dissolved and outlawed. A minor and powerless council was permitted at Lydda, but public instruction in the law was prohibited on pain of death. Several rabbis were executed for disobeying this injunction. Akiba, now 95, insisted on teaching his pupils. He was imprisoned for 3 years, but taught even in jail. He was tried and condemned, and died, we are told, with the basic tenet of Judaism on his lips. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Though Hadrian's decrees were softened by Antoninus Pius, the Jews did not for centuries recover from the disaster of Bar Kokhba's revolt. From this moment they entered their Middle Ages, abandoning all secular learning except medicine, renouncing every form of Hellenism, and taking comfort and unity only from their rabbis, their mystic poets, and their law. No other people has ever known so long an exile, or so hard a fate. Shut out from their holy city, the Jews were compelled to surrender at first to paganism, then to Christianity. Scattered into every province and beyond, condemned to poverty and humiliation, unbefriended even by philosophers and saints, they retired from public affairs into private study and worship, passionately preserving the words of their scholars and preparing to write them down at last in the Talmuds of Babylonia and Palestine. Judaism hid in fear and obscurity, while its offspring, Christianity, went out to conquer the world. Book 5. The Youth of Christianity, 4 B.C. to A.D. 325. Chapter 26. Jesus, 4 B.C. to A.D. 30. 1. The Sources. Did Christ exist? Is the life story of the founder of Christianity the product of human sorrow, imagination, and hope? A myth comparable to the legends of Krishna, Osiris, Attis, Adonis, Dionysus, and Mithras? Early in the 18th century, the circle of Bolingbroke, shocking even Voltaire, privately discussed the possibility that Jesus had never lived. Volney propounded the same doubt in his Ruins of Empire in 1791. Napoleon, meeting the German scholar Wieland in 1808, asked him no petty question of politics or war, but did he believe in the historicity of Christ? One of the most far-reaching activities of the modern mind has been the higher criticism of the Bible, the mounting attack upon its authenticity and veracity, countered by the heroic attempt to save the historical foundations of Christian faith. The results may in time prove as revolutionary as Christianity itself. The first engagement in this 200-year war was fought in silence by Hermann Reimarus, professor of Oriental languages at Hamburg. On his death in 1768, he left, cautiously unpublished, a 1,400-page manuscript on the life of Christ. 6 years later, Gotthold Blessing, over the protests of his friends, published portions of it as the Wolfenbüttel fragments. Reimarus argued that Jesus can only be regarded and understood not as the founder of Christianity, but as the final and dominant figure in the mystical eschatology of the Jews. That is, Christ thought not of establishing a new religion, but of preparing men for the imminent destruction of the world and God's last judgment of all souls. In 1796, Herder pointed out the apparently irreconcilable difference between the Christ of Matthew, Mark, and Luke and the Christ of the Gospel of St. John. In 1828, Heinrich Paulus, summarizing the life of Christ in 1192 pages, proposed a rationalistic interpretation of the miracles, that is, accepted their occurrence but ascribed them to natural causes and powers. In an epoch-marking Life of Jesus, 1835-36, David Strauss rejected this compromise. The supernatural elements in the Gospels he thought should be classed as myths, and the actual career of Christ must be reconstructed without using these elements in any form. Strauss's massive volumes made biblical criticism the storm center of German thought for a generation. In the same year, Ferdinand Christian Bauer attacked the epistles of Paul, rejecting as unauthentic all but those to the Galatians, Corinthians, and Romans. In 1840, Bruno Bauer began a series of passionately controversial works aiming to show that Jesus was a myth, the personified form of a cult that evolved in the 2nd century from a fusion of Jewish, Greek, and Roman theology. In 1863, Ernest Renan's Life of Jesus, alarming millions with its rationalism and charming millions with its prose, gathered together the results of German criticism and brought the problem of the Gospels before the entire educated world. The French school reached its climax at the end of the century in the Abbé Loisy, who subjected the New Testament to such rigorous textual analysis that the Catholic Church felt compelled to excommunicate him and other modernists. Meanwhile, the Dutch school of Pearson, Naber, and Matas carried the movement to its farthest point by laboriously denying the historical reality of Jesus. In Germany, Arthur Dreves gave this negative conclusion its definitive exposition in 1906. And in England, W.B. Smith and J.M. Robertson argued to a like denial. The result of 2 centuries of discussion seemed to be the annihilation of Christ. What evidence is there for Christ's existence? The earliest non-Christian reference occurs in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, possibly from A.D. 93. At that time lived Jesus, a holy man, if man he may be called, for he performed wonderful works and taught men and joyfully received the truth. And he was followed by many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Messiah. There may be a genuine core in these strange lines, but the high praise given to Christ by a Jew uniformly anxious to please either the Romans or the Jews, both at that time in conflict with Christianity, renders the passage suspect, and Christian scholars reject it as almost certainly an interpolation. There are references to Yeshua of Nazareth in the Talmud, but they are too late in date to be certainly more than counter-echoes of Christian thought. The oldest known mention of Christ in pagan literature is in a letter of the younger Pliny, circa 110, asking the advice of Trajan on the treatment of Christians. 5 years later, Tacitus described Nero's persecution of the Christiani in Rome, and pictured them as already, in AD 64, numbering adherents throughout the empire. The paragraph is so Tacitian in style, force, and prejudice that of all biblical critics only Dreves questions its authenticity. Suetonius, circa 125, mentions the same persecution and reports Claudius's banishment, circa 52, of Jews who, stirred up by Christ, impulsore Christo, were causing public disturbances. The passage accords well with the Acts of the Apostles, which mentions a decree of Claudius that the Jews should leave Rome. These references prove the existence of Christians rather than of Christ. But unless we assume the latter, we are driven to the improbable hypothesis that Jesus was invented in one generation. Moreover, we must suppose that the Christian community in Rome had been established some years before 52 to merit the attention of an imperial decree. About the middle of this 1st century, a pagan named Thallus, in a fragment preserved by Julius Africanus, argued that the abnormal darkness alleged to have accompanied the death of Christ was a purely natural phenomenon and coincidence. The argument took the existence of Christ for granted. The denial of that existence seems never to have occurred even to the bitterest Gentile or Jewish opponents of nascent Christianity. The Christian evidence for Christ begins with the letters ascribed to St. Paul. Some of these are of uncertain authorship. Several, antedating AD 64, are almost universally accounted as substantially genuine. No one has questioned the existence of Paul or his repeated meetings with Peter, James, and John. And Paul enviously admits that these men had known Christ in the flesh. The accepted epistles frequently refer to the Last Supper and the crucifixion. Matters are not so simple as regards the Gospels. The 4 that have come down to us are survivors from a much larger number that once circulated among the Christians of the first 2 centuries. Our English term gospel, Old English Godspell or good news, is a rendering of the Greek euangelion, which is the opening word of Mark and means glad tidings, that the Messiah had come and the kingdom of God was at hand. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic. Their contents and episodes allow of being arranged in parallel columns and viewed together. They were written in the Greek koine of popular speech and were no models of grammar or literary finish. Nevertheless, the directness and force of their simple style, the vivid power of their analogies and scenes, the depth of their feeling, and the profound fascination of the story they tell give even the rude originals a unique charm, immensely enhanced for the English world by the highly inaccurate but lordly version made for King James. The oldest extant copies of the Gospels go back only to the 3rd century. The original compositions were apparently written between AD 60 and 120, and were therefore exposed to 2 centuries of errors in transcription and to possible alterations to suit the theology or aims of the copyists, sect, or time. Christian writers before 100 quote the Old but never the New Testament. The only reference to a Christian gospel before 150 is in Papias, who about 135 reports an unidentified John the Elder as saying that Mark had composed his gospel from memories conveyed to him by Peter. Papias adds, Matthew transcribed in Hebrew the Logia, apparently an early Aramaic collection of the sayings of Christ. Probably Paul had some such document, for though he mentions no Gospels, he occasionally quotes the direct words of Jesus. Criticism generally agrees in giving the Gospel of Mark priority, and in dating it between 65 and 70. Since it sometimes repeats the same matter in different forms, it is widely believed to have been based upon the Logia, and upon another early narrative which may have been the original composition of Mark himself. Our Gospel of Mark was apparently circulated while some of the apostles or their immediate disciples were still alive. It seems unlikely, therefore, that it differed substantially from their recollection and interpretation of Christ. We may conclude with the brilliant but judicious Schweitzer that the Gospel of Mark is, in essentials, genuine history. Orthodox tradition placed Matthew's Gospel first. Irenaeus describes it as originally composed in Hebrew, that is, Aramaic, but it has come down to us only in Greek. Since in this form it apparently copies Mark and probably also the Logia, criticism inclines to ascribe it to a disciple of Matthew rather than to the publican himself. Even the most skeptical students, however, concede to it as early a date as AD 85 to 90. Aiming to convert Jews, Matthew relies more than the other evangelists on the miracles ascribed to Jesus, and is suspiciously eager to prove that many Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled in Christ. Nevertheless, it is the most moving of the 4 Gospels, and must be ranked among the unconscious masterpieces of the world's literature. The Gospel according to St. Luke, generally assigned to the last decade of the 1st century, announces its desire to coordinate and reconcile earlier accounts of Jesus, and aims to convert not Jews but Gentiles. Very probably Luke was himself a Gentile, the friend of Paul, and the author of the Acts of the Apostles. Like Matthew, he borrows much from Mark. Of the 661 verses in the received text of Mark, over 600 are reproduced in Matthew, and 350 in Luke, mostly word for word. Many passages in Luke that are not in Mark occur in Matthew, again nearly verbatim. Apparently Luke borrowed these from Matthew, or Luke and Matthew took them from a common source, now lost. Luke works up these candid borrowings with some literary skill. Renan thought this Gospel the most beautiful book ever written. The 4th Gospel does not pretend to be a biography of Jesus. It is a presentation of Christ from the theological point of view, as the divine Logos, or Word, creator of the world and redeemer of mankind. It contradicts the synoptic Gospels in 100 details and in its general picture of Christ. The half-Gnostic character of the work and its emphasis on metaphysical ideas have led many Christian scholars to doubt that its author was the Apostle John. Experience suggests, however, that an old tradition must not be too quickly rejected. Our ancestors were not all fools. Recent studies tend to restore the 4th Gospel to a date near the end of the 1st century. Probably tradition was correct in assigning to the same author the Epistles of John. They speak the same ideas in the same style. In summary, it is clear that there are many contradictions between one gospel and another, many dubious statements of history, many suspicious resemblances to the legends told of pagan gods, many incidents apparently designed to prove the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, many passages possibly aiming to establish a historical basis for some later doctrine or ritual of the Church. The evangelists shared with Cicero, Sallust, and Tacitus the conception of history as a vehicle for moral ideas. And presumably the conversations and speeches reported in the Gospels were subject to the frailties of illiterate memories and the errors or emendations of copyists. All this granted, much remains. The contradictions are of minutiae, not substance. In essentials, the synoptic Gospels agree remarkably well and form a consistent portrait of Christ. In the enthusiasm of its discoveries, the higher criticism is applied to the New Testament tests of authenticity so severe that by them 100 ancient worthies, for example Hammurabi, David, Socrates, would fade into legend. Despite the prejudices and theological preconceptions of the evangelists, they record many incidents that mere inventors would have concealed. The competition of the apostles for high places in the kingdom, their flight after Jesus' arrest, Peter's denial, the failure of Christ to work miracles in Galilee, the references of some auditors to his possible insanity, his early uncertainty as to his mission, his confessions of ignorance as to the future, his moments of bitterness, his despairing cry on the cross. No one reading these scenes can doubt the reality of the figure behind them. That a few simple men should in one generation have invented so powerful and appealing a personality, so lofty an ethic and so inspiring a vision of human brotherhood, would be a miracle far more incredible than any recorded in the Gospels. After 2 centuries of higher criticism, the outlines of the life, character, and teaching of Christ remain reasonably clear and constitute the most fascinating feature in the history of Western man. 2. The growth of Jesus. Matthew and Luke assign Jesus' birth to the days when Herod was king of Judea, consequently before 3 B.C. Luke, however, describes Jesus as about 30 years old when John baptized him in the 15th year of Tiberius, that is, A.D. 28 to 29. This would place Christ's birth in the year 2 to 1 B.C. Luke adds that, "In those days there went out a decree of Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, when Quirinius was governor of Syria." Quirinius is known to have been legate in Syria between A.D. 6 and 12. Josephus notes a census by him in Judea, but ascribes it to A.D. 6 to 7. We have no further mention of this census. Tertullian records a census of Judea by Saturninus, governor of Syria, from 8 to 7 B.C. If this is the census that Luke had in mind, the birth of Christ would have to be placed before 6 B.C. We have no knowledge of the specific day of his birth. Clement of Alexandria, circa 200, reports diverse opinions on the subject in his day. Some chronologists dating the birth April 19th, some May 20th. He himself assigned it to November 17th, 3 B.C. As far back as the 2nd century, the Eastern Christians celebrated the Nativity on January 6th. In 354, some Western churches, including those of Rome, commemorated the birth of Christ on December 25th. This was then erroneously calculated as the winter solstice, on which the days begin to lengthen. It was already the central festival of Mithraism, the Natalis Invicti Solis, or birthday of the unconquered sun. The Eastern churches clung for a time to January 6th and charged their Western brethren with sun worship and idolatry, but by the end of the 4th century, December 25th had been adopted also in the East. Matthew and Luke place the birth of Christ in Bethlehem, 5 miles south of Jerusalem. Thence, they tell us, the family moved to Nazareth in Galilee. Mark makes no mention of Bethlehem, but merely names Christ Jesus of Nazareth. His parents gave him the quite common name Yeshua, or Joshua, meaning the help of Yahweh. The Greeks made this into Jesus, I-E-S-O-U-S, the Romans into Jesus, I-E-S-U-S. He was apparently one of a large family, for his neighbors, marveling at his authoritative teaching, asked, "Where did he get this wisdom and the power to do these wonders? Is he not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother named Mary? And are not his brothers named James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And do not his sisters live here among us?" Luke tells the story of the Annunciation with some literary art and puts into the mouth of Miriam, or Mary, that Magnificat, which is one of the great poems embedded in the New Testament. Next to her son, Mary is the most touching figure in the narrative. Rearing him through all the painful joys of motherhood, proud of his youthful learning, wondering later at his doctrine and his claims, wishing to withdraw him from the exciting throng of his followers and bring him back to the healing quiet of his home. "Thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing," helplessly witnessing his crucifixion and receiving his body into her arms. If this is not history, it is supreme literature, for the relations of parents and children hold deeper dramas than those of sexual love. The tales later circulated by Celsus and others about Mary and a Roman soldier are by critical consent clumsy fabrications. Not so awkward are the stories, chiefly contained in the apocryphal or uncanonical Gospels, about the birth of Christ in a cave or stable, the adoration of the shepherds and the Magi, the massacre of the innocents, and the flight into Egypt. The mature mind will not resent this popular poetry. The virgin birth is not mentioned by Paul or John, and Matthew and Luke, who tell of it, trace Jesus back to David through Joseph by conflicting genealogies. Apparently the belief in the virgin birth rose later than that in the Davidic descent. The evangelists tell us little of Christ's youth. When he was 8 days old, he was circumcised. Joseph was a carpenter, and the occupational heredity usual in that age suggests that Jesus followed that pleasant trade for a time. He knew the craftsmen of his village, and the landlords, stewards, tenants, and slaves of his rural surroundings. His speech is studded with them. He was sensitive to the natural beauties of the countryside, to the grace and color of flowers, and the silent fruitfulness of trees. The story of his questioning the scholars in the temple is not incredible. He had an alert and curious mind, and in the Near East a boy of 12 already touches maturity. But he had no formal education. "How is it," his neighbors asked, "that this man can read when he has never gone to school?" He attended the synagogue and heard the scriptures with evident delight. The prophets and the Psalms above all sank deep into his memory and helped to mold him. Perhaps he read also the books of Daniel and Enoch, for his later teaching was shot through with their visions of the Messiah, the Last Judgment, and the coming kingdom of God. The air he breathed was tense with religious excitement. Thousands of Jews awaited anxiously the Redeemer of Israel. Magic and witchcraft, demons and angels, possession and exorcism, miracles and prophecies, divination and astrology were taken for granted everywhere. Probably the story of the Magi was a necessary concession to the astrological convictions of the age. Thaumaturgists, wonder workers, toured the towns. On the annual journeys that all good Palestinian Jews made to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, Jesus must have learned something of the Essenes and their half-monastic, almost Buddhistic life. Possibly he heard also of a sect called Nazarenes who dwelt beyond the Jordan in Perea, rejected temple worship, and denied the binding character of the law. But the experience that aroused him to religious fervor was the preaching of John, the son of Mary's cousin Elizabeth. Josephus tells John's story in some detail. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1.